By far the most important and life-changing map that we can create is a map of ourselves. And the purpose of creating a map is so that the conscious part of our brain can build a conscious relationship with the unconscious shapes, with the unconscious fields, which create probability fields in our lives. Now, this is a very interesting attachment map right here. We see a slope. We see two extreme positions. We see a round bar. And then we have a fair amount of weight on it at both ends. Imagine a weight bar with weights on both ends. And what this image communicates is that if you get it balanced just right up here, you're pretty good. But that if something knocks you off and this bar starts to roll down, the further it gets towards the extreme, the more locked in it is. And it takes a lot of work. You could even have a groove at the end here, so that once the bar gets to that point, it gets stuck in what's called a rut. It takes a lot of effort to lift up the weight and then push it uphill up to this middle position where it's very vulnerable. As soon as you leave it unattended for a little bit, it rushes down to one extreme or the other. And this is actually a map of early childhood attachment disorder. When a child is unable to have a secure, healthy attachment with either parent, then they will typically vacillate rapidly from the extremes of complete dissociation to the extreme of clinging desperately. And it looks a bit like this. In a healthy attachment picture, the side profile looks like this. You have the bar, and you have little teeth all the way along this pattern. And so every change is incremental. There's no rapid, unregulated change. And over on this side, you have intense, conscious attachment. For example, when you love, in order to reach certain domains in the terrain of love, you choose to need. And you also choose to allow yourself to be needed, and you choose to show up for that need. So it's a conscious choice. And you get there in little increments. I like you, I feel good, I move it a few inches along. I still feel good, so I move it a few inches along. I watched you with an elderly woman, and I liked the way you treated her, so I move it another little bit along. And I check in with you, and I see what you do with your bar of attachment. Do you open up to me? Do you give to me those domains of your psyche that need love and that need attention? And when I love and attend to those parts, do you receive the love and attention that I give? And when you receive it, do you let that strengthen you so that you're a stronger human being? And vice versa. And so this is a template for a consciously mediated incremental relationship of mutual healthy attachment or dissociation. Because when I watch how you treat this elderly woman, I step back a little bit. So with one person, I slowly move towards intense, conscious, mutual connection and attachment. And with another person, I consciously step away and dissociate to a point where we don't interact at all. So this flat line and these small teeth create a framework for regulated conscious change and mediation. And it allows for a very wide range of interactions. You can have the person you say hello with, and that's at this level, and you can have the person that you talk for 5 or 10 minutes about the weather, and you can have the person that you open up and share something meaningful from time to time, but don't need because you don't have that kind of interaction where they're either reliably, available or, that need is mutual. And then over here you have, complete devotional, open and beautiful expressions of mutually chosen love that includes the deep satisfaction of needing and being needed. So that's the kind of thing that a child can feel out with a parent when the parent is regulated and stable and integrated. And the child can feel out different positions and relate to this part of the parent from this persona and this part of the parent from that other persona and relate to this area of the parent like this and this area like this. And the child gets to feel and learn and map out for themselves that full range of connection. But when you have an incestuous parent on the one hand and an emotionally dissociative parent on the other hand, you've got, these two polarities. And one's overwhelming. It's like having chocolate cake stuffed into your mouth, one cake after another. And the other is like being starved. There's no middle ground. There's no safe space in order to explore the relationship. Now, a template is just what it looks like. It's a guide. If you can imagine it carved in steel, this is a steel template. Got a steel ball here, a steel bar. Now, the amount of emotional charge that you connect with this process of association or dissociation determines how intensely, how much momentum these movements within your template occur with. And the momentum and the intensity with which they occur determines how much will it takes to move within the template. If you have a situation of trauma and PTSD and a trigger situation that knocks you into this groove here, you may not have the willpower to get out of that rut and push 400 pounds of weight back up into the midpoint. You may be locked in that extreme until you've got the help of 3 or 4 people to hold the bar in this place. And if you don't have the muscles, because one of the things that happens when you get locked in a rut with a weight that's too heavy to carry is you don't get stronger, because you get stronger by practicing, which means you've got to be able to lift the weight. You got to be able to lift the weight, and then every day you get a little bit stronger. You make your muscles a little bit sore, and then they get a little bit stronger. And when you've got a 400-pound weight in muscles that only can lift 30 pounds, those muscles never get strong because they never can lift the 400-pound weight. Not once. The 400-pound weight came onto you when you were 5 years old. It presses into you. And at 5 years old, you can never lift that weight one time. And so you can't build the muscle that other people can deal with when they've got a 30-pound weight. And then they lift it up and down. And then after they've lifted a 30-pound weight for a certain amount of time, then they're given a 40-pound weight. And they build up the muscles for that, and they get a little older. And then they get a 50-pound weight, and it's a graduated return. And so they're able to anchor in their body and their psyche the maturation process, which gives them range and gives them conscious mastery of the terrain and the psyche within their range, their conscious range. I have lifted this in this area before. This is how much effort I need to lift a 30-pound weight. This is how much effort I need to lift a 70-pound weight. My limit, my boundary, is a 200-pound weight. And I have to prepare myself like this, and then I can just barely lift a 200-pound weight. If it's more than 200 pounds, I need support like this and like this. And this is a map. It's an incredibly important map that many of us, in an emotionally and in a psychologically illiterate culture, will never learn what our attachment pattern is as a template. Now, these templates are steel, and depending on the thickness of the emotion, the intensity of the repetition, the templates are either very, very thick or they're unsubstantial. Anything can be cut and recut, but you need to understand the template frame within which you're dealing. You can't just take a hand to 1/8-inch steel and expect the hand with its mass and density to cut through the steel. But you can take the hand and use the hand to get a hacksaw, and you can draw a more favorable template. And if you understand the mechanism of the cut, you can slowly cut through that steel and create another template. For example, here it might be really nice to cut in a V up at the midpoint as a relatively low-intensive cut, so that I don't constantly have to feel like I'm balancing this tremendously heavy weight that is constantly threatening to tip over in an environment that is hostile, consciously or otherwise, that's trying to destabilize me. So this is a map of the attachment template, which of course, this map up down here leads to extremes. I'm completely connected, and I need you, and I need you to need me, and we have to be really close, and that's fine. But I can't go to the midpoint here. If we start to get into this middle terrain, it starts moving around, and I have to disconnect and separate, and then I'm fine too. I'm fine in these two extremes, but this middle terrain is tremendously chaotic, tremendously overwhelming, tremendously hard to regulate. with a template like this. Now, there are infinite numbers of dimensions and infinite numbers of distinction. This is one of an infinite number of distinctions. And yet, if you understand that my attachment map looks closer to this than this, and if I understand that my attachment map looks closer to this than to this, then we have a basis for partnering. To partner to do a couple of useful things. To either create a really secure, strong mutual attachment, or to fully disengage, or to do research and science and support in the process of changing the template. We also have a counterpoint to understand how this template may interact with your template. Then we can look at templates of trauma coping mechanisms, survival strategies, etc. So the first thing that is really interesting to me at this point, because I've related to a lot of this information verbally, less of it visually. I see things in pictures, and then there usually isn't a chalkboard to communicate. So I've got to translate the pictures into words so that other people can relate to them when a chalkboard isn't handy. And so this is actually something that, is very rich for me to take the words back into pictures so that people better understand the words. Because unless you've been under a 400-pound weight in an unregulated and unstable environment and watch things slam down this way or slam down this way and not feel the ability to affect what one feels, and to get it up there and work really hard and get it up there and then have 2 or 3 people just knock it down again. And it takes a few weeks to get back up, and it needs just the right environment. You've got to wait for that point when the wheel turns and comes up, and then someone else knocks it down. Unless you felt that and felt the absolute desperation and loneliness and frustration of realizing that no one else has a clue what you're going through, that they will never ask in 100 years, that they don't have the paradigm to understand how valuable it is to understand that, but that they will blame you for ending up in one of these polarities, as if somehow I had no idea. Unless you felt that as a visceral sense, then you have no basis for empathy. You have no basis for understanding. You have no basis for an intelligent response. So this section is about how to map yourself. Now, I've just demonstrated a mapping process. Together, we've mapped 2 different shapes of attachment template. Attachment means how close you connect in the arena in the brain that regulates attachment, emotional and the corresponding physical attachment. If you sleep with someone for 20 years and they die and their body isn't there, your body will ache and miss and long for the chemicals that are released by that particular person's rhythm and breathing, because those chemicals will not be released with another person. A whole part of the personality dies and is released with the death of a long-term lover who you actually knew how to love. And that makes room for something new to be born, which is uncertain, which is unformed, which which is not guaranteed, which is what makes the clinging that much more desperate. When out there lies an unknown that we don't know how to relate to exactly. And that's what makes you so scary to other people. You're a vast probability field of unknowns, and it makes you hard to relate to. Makes you hard to open to in the deeper ways. You're an infinite probability field, and that makes it hard to open up to all that you are to yourself. Let's see. There we go. Now, the first thing is a routine and a protocol. You are too big and you are too complicated to map in a day, probably in a month. So one of the best things to do is to start a mapping document. Open a document on autosave. It saves itself every few minutes. Has a backup file, preferably stored online so that you can, if a device gets lost, so you've created a secure foundation, a container to begin mapping out who you are. Now, if anyone is intelligent enough to A, want a relationship with you, and B, want that relationship to be based on transparent data with the intention of winning together, win-winning together by respecting and responding to that data, they will be grateful. They will honor your intelligence to put that data out there in a series of patterns that can be communicated. I once went on a date, and leery as I am of blind trust and the setup that it represents, I noticed in the pattern of evasiveness and in the lack of intelligent projection in the woman who was clearly interested in having sex with me. And I decided to interrupt the pattern. And so I asked her what she thought she knew about me. And she said something, and I corrected her. She said something flattering. I corrected her and said something unflattering about myself. And I also, from what I could tell about her body language, etc., I picked a few things about myself that I thought would be very unappealing to her personality and, value hierarchy, etc. And I said, so you like me, yes, and you want to connect, and you imagine I'm like this. I said, so let's lift the veil of projection and talk about some things that might be difficult for you. And I shared 3 things that I didn't think she would anticipate and that most people don't volunteer. And she was shocked. And I said, I'm the same person that you were happily projecting on 10 minutes ago. But now you're not so sure, right? And she agreed. She was quite nervous. And I said, well, here's the thing. 99% of the men out there would never tell you those three things. It's not because they're unusual. It's just not first date material in our cult. But I have told you those three things, and they're all useful data for your well-being. And I didn't have to tell you any of them. And I know you are less interested in being sexual because I told you that. I knew that before I told you that. And I don't care if we have sex or not. But I want you to notice that you're anxious because I've protected your well-being more than 90% of the people you're going to meet in this situation. Now, you think you're scared of me because of what I've told you. And you are scared of me. But that's not what you should be afraid of. You should be afraid of the woman who, without gathering any data, projected this fantasy. And on the basis of that fantasy and no actual data, wanted to sleep with a man you don't know. You should be alarmed at that woman because she's still there. Because I don't expect your system of safety and intelligence to actually want to proceed with this relationship. If you wanted depth and transparency, etc., you would have asked questions rather than flood the situation with positive data that was projected. So we're not going to have sex, and you're going to be relieved. And you're going to go off using the same template, and you're going to project, you're going to find someone like me. Obviously, you were attracted to me, so your algorithm led you to me. Then I'm being transparent with you in a way that you don't actually like, and so that's leading you away from me. And then it's going to lead you back to who you're drawn to, which is someone like me. But most of the people like me are not going to say this and this and this, because most of them are not raised in this cult to value the quality of intimacy and connection that is possible with a first date like this, as opposed to a first date of enactment of fantasy-based projection with a slow deterioration over the next 3 weeks as you tell yourself you did everything right, you gave the benefit of the doubt, you were trusting, you did all these things, and then why doesn't it ever work out for you? Well, I've no interest in being at the other end of your projection-based disappointment. It's completely unnecessary. You can create new actual data about me that's just as flattering, that's based on the truth. And you can grow into a bigger woman who's confident and comfortable navigating in this kind of vulnerability and transparency. And then you will be a safer woman for yourself, and you'll be more interesting to me. Interested in the part of me that wants a healthy relationship more than I want to get in your bed. So, where do you want to go? Well, she wanted to leave. And And this gets into the realm of value hierarchy. We all have a value hierarchy that includes valuing the same things everyone else values. Everyone values the same things. They just value them in a different order. One person values risk for the adrenaline rush that it provides more than another person values risk for the adrenaline rush it provides. One person's stimulation threshold is different than another's, so the risk factor that is necessary for one person to get 6 ounces of adrenaline is different than the risk environment necessary to give someone else 6 ounces of adrenaline. Meaning, for one person, just looking online and responding to a text delivers an 80% stimulation threshold. Oh my God, what's happening? What's all this? For someone else, it's a 5%. It's boring. They want to engage and meet and do this and see what happens here. They're both looking for a comfortable 50, 65% adrenaline rush. It's just the environment that induces it is different because different people have a different stimulation threshold. There's 20% of the population, myself included, that would categorize as highly sensitive, which just means they have a low stimulation threshold, meaning that much less has to go on for them to feel incredibly stimulated and at times overwhelmed. And it doesn't matter what it is. If you think of stimulation like an appetite, my wife likes taking 1 or 2 bites of chocolate cake, and then she's had enough. I like having a whole piece, and then I've had enough. If someone stuffs 3 pieces into my mouth, I'm disgusted. If I stuff a whole piece into my wife's mouth, she's disgusted. Disgust is the phenomena of having a dose of energy and experience beyond our ability to digest it and be present for it and enjoy it. That is what is disgust. When one person who's highly aroused drops their clothes, it's not disgusting for them. But if they're with a partner who's not even sure they want to have a second date, the exact same image that could be an invitation, that could be exciting, that could be fantastic, if they were in an aroused state, is disgusting. It's disgusting because it's maybe 5 to 10 times more intensity, more volume of information than the person can digest. They open their mouth for a teaspoon and you pour it in a gallon, and they're choking and they're coughing and they want nothing more than you to get away. They may feel traumatized that so much happened in that little opening. And now you're the enemy, not because the food wasn't good, but because you don't have the talent for regulating the dispensing of the energy in sizes that the other person can consume. When you look at different people and different attitudes, one of the things you can realize is I'm talking to a camera in the dose at which this kind of conversation is 30% stimulating to me. Meaning, my peak stimulation in this context would hit at about 8 hours. 8 hours of this kind of flow and dialogue would see me maxed out, highly stimulated, highly excited. And I'm in a culture where the listener maxes out at maybe 10, 15 minutes as a peak, and then wants a little bit of pause and integration. So we have a gap between 8 hours and 10, 15 minutes, which means that it creates a phenomena, a chemistry, in which one of the things that has occurred with discerning and intelligent people that know how to regulate themselves is they'll close by saying, I feel like you've given me about 6 months of stuff to digest. And it's been riveting, and it's been high quality, and it's been extraordinarily valuable. And I'll circle around in 10 months or so when I'm ready for another bite. And for me, I'd be ready for the conversation to last another 3 or 4 hours before I reached that point. Well, it's a little bit like walking. And if one person is walking at 1 mile an hour and one person is walking at 1.1 mile per hour, after an hour, you're going to be 0.1 miles apart. But you'll still be in talking range for maybe the first, 300-400 steps, etc. This does not mean that the fast walker is wrong. It doesn't mean that the slow walker is wrong. In general, it works better if the fast walker slows down to the slow walker's pace. If I want to feed you 3 pieces of chocolate cake and you want to eat half a slice, it generally works better in intended impact if I feed you half a slice of cake rather than 3. And this is a very important thing to understand around terrain such as love. Because whatever it is, sex, physical sex, conversation, mental sex, emotional sex, sex of rhythm, coming into a similar rhythm, of lifestyle, of proximity, of companionship, a similar rhythm as opposed to, a dissociative rhythm. They come into a similar rhythm of breathing, of communicating. There's a small to major resistance between every individual in different areas of rhythm and pace and volume. And it generally works better in terms of the intended impact if the more intense. If one person is getting an earache with the sound of the volume and 80% of the people would like it a bit louder, if you want a relationship with the person who's getting an earache, the volume has to go down. If you want to stay close to the person who can only walk this fast, the fast person has to slow down. If one person has a drag race car and can go 500 miles an hour and the other one has a Honda Civic that starts rattling at around 85, if you want to drive together, you have to slow down to 85 or less. But it does create a frustration point. If there's one drag car surrounded by 1,000 Civics, and the drag car can never race and stay connected at the same time. It creates a frustration. And this is the frustration of bottled up potential that people with an extraordinary ability in a niche area, particularly an uncommon niche area, but who are no better or worse as human beings than anyone else, encounter one person after another that require a 500% reduction in capacity, in speed, in momentum, in intention, in intensity, in order to accommodate the digestive tract for that mode of energy in the other person. It is incredibly frustrating. And it's also a very nuanced experience, meaning the fact that someone could have an 8-hour conversation in depth and would max out there in this area does not translate into other areas. And so one of the things that's most difficult is when one person has a shape like this, and the other person has a shape like this, then the question is how volatile, how much volatility does the movement between these two extremes occur with? Because if it's every 5 minutes, I love you, I need you, I don't want anything to do with you, I love you, I need you, I don't want anything to do with you. If it's every 5 minutes, that gets into the terrain where someone can't track you. So it's called crazy. It's just a fast tempo of those two extremes without the ability in an emotionally and psychologically illiterate culture to take someone into the picture where they could even understand what's going on. The person living that tempo understands completely. I felt absolute desperation for you over here. Then you didn't meet me over there, and I felt lonely, so I pushed you away. Then you didn't like being pushed away, so I tried to move towards you, but I have this kind of all or nothing kind of shape, and so I moved for you, but then that was too much, and so I pulled back. And then you complained that I pulled back, and so I rushed in, and then, and it's moving back at a fast, and so the person living this volatility understands it completely. The person experiencing it has no idea how to relate to it graphically, has no idea how to relate to it verbally, has no idea how to comprehend the archaeological data that produces such a phenomena. In this case, the archaeology of the psyche, the structural templates and how they were formed. When the earth is liquid, with certain materials and certain temperatures, it shapes like this. Then when it cools off, that lava that could have been pushed effortlessly with a bulldozer, now you have to grind away with it with a diamond saw because you're dealing with it in a hardened form. Every individual is a juxtaposition of this archaeology of the liquid and the formed. When you have anomalous shapes, like the 1 in 1,000, every culture, of course, creates a probability field in which there are a variety of roles and responses. When you create this 1 in 1,000 probability. It's not efficient for the other 999 to get to know and anticipate and prepare for the 1 in 1,000 that is created within the probability field of a given cult. So they don't. It is efficient for the 1 in 1,000 to learn the other 999 because they're dealing with them every day, which means that the 1 in 1,000 understands themselves in a way that 999 do not. Maybe another 1 in 1,000 does. And they also understand the 999 from 2 points of perspective, being able to see what it's like to be one of the 999 or whether or 1 in 100. Because if you're in a 10%, if you're in a 20% minority or greater, it's in everyone's interest to learn about you, and so they do. If you're in a 30% minority, people probably have bothered to watch a documentary or asked some friends, why did they do that? Why do they bow and pray like that? Well, that's because of this and this and that and the other. Now you have a shared language. So you're not in isolation. Everyone understands your mechanism. But when that doesn't happen for the 1 in 1,000, they understand the mechanism of the other people from the position of the other people, but they also understand it in relationship to themselves. They have a very wide depth perception from these two converging perspectives. The you that you think you are from your perspective and the you that I think you are from my perspective, coming from very wide angles, creates extraordinary clarity and depth perception. The kind of way you would design, if you want a 3D representation of reality, you want a 180 oppositional context. You want one camera pointing from this angle and the other pointing from that angle, and you want to see the whole planet of the individual, the whole planet of the planet. And the filmmaker is exuberant with such a wide spectrum of data and dimensionality. The culturally illiterate individual is overwhelmed by the apparent presentation of paradox. The earth is hot. The earth is cold. The earth is light. The earth is dark. The earth is like this. It's very high. The earth is very low. The earth is wet. The earth is dry. What is it? It's all of it. Because if you take a snapshot of the earth at any given moment, it's dark on one side and it's light and burning on the other. It's hot in this pole and it's hot near the equator and it's cold in this pole and it's cold in this pole. It's wet underwater. It's all of it. It's multidimensional. The overwhelm of paradoxical information synthesizes with complexity and capacity to digest complexity into something that's stunningly dimensional. But you can't be succinct, and you cannot be black and white in that kind of presentation. Because all it means if you say, no, the earth is not dark, because at that moment in your region of the world it's sunny, all it means is that you can't comprehend a world that is big enough to hold the paradox. And if you say, no, I'm not an angry person, I'm a joyful, grateful person, and how dare you talk about my anger? Oh, maybe you're angry that I'm talking about your anger. Well, of course, because I'm not an angry person, and It's not okay for you to be angry in 1 minute and joyful in the next. It's not okay that you're black over here and white over here. It's not okay that this part of you is incredibly dumb And this part of you over here is incredibly wise. And this part of you is just smart. It's not wise, it just has figured things out. It's cleverly doing dumb things. You figured out how to game the casinos and you're blowing it on hookers rather than doing something meaningful, rather than figuring out how to gamify your own time management system and transforming yourself into a 10x individual. You see, there's wisdom and there's smartness. Well, this is a tenth of 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 the complexity of who we are. It's a little taster that fits somewhat on the edges of a 2-hour attention span. For certain things, a movie from time to time. But I wanted to emphasize and come back to this idea of making a map of who you are that you can understand. And that anyone who is intelligent enough to know that understanding you and your efforts to be understandable is a heck of a good idea can understand you as well. And we come now to a book project that I created probably about 6 years ago. Maybe 7. You can see my old name. And it's called Intimacy. Into me you see. Co-creating high-value relationships with me. And I wrote this in a month, but, you know, I've got 60,000 pages under my belt of, you know, digesting things. So, you know, it's been ready to come out for decades. It's just nobody asked. And so, you know, what I wanted to accomplish with this book was 2 things. One is I wanted all the people who weren't asking and who didn't know to know how much they didn't know, which is miles ahead of someone pretending that they know something they don't even know enough to know that they don't know. And 2, pretending that because they already know that there's nothing to ask or nothing to inquire about. And 3, that if we're not connecting, it must be for a reason that they're projecting based on the stuff they don't even know they don't know, as opposed to what's actually going on. There's nothing more maddening than having arrogant psychopaths or people in a psychopathic state arrogantly behaving in a way that causes enormous harm and then blaming you for being harmed because they don't even have the humility to understand that they don't understand, let alone the humility and the time, the enormous amount of time it takes to bridge a gap between a shape like this and a shape like this. And so I wanted to make it clear visually. And it does, because my wife has not read this full book. And I think that's pretty dumb. But it gives a conversation point. Like, well, how many pages have you read this month? And what did you learn about that? And why is it that you're so interested in our marriage growing and so uninterested in seeing me? How does that fit together? And does it fit together? And are you willing to think about that? So it provides a tool for that kind of awareness. On the flip side, having just criticized the areas of my wife's stupidity, she's also one of the most intelligent people that I know, because she's the first woman who sat down and wrote me a book like this before our second date. And I thought that was impressive. This is what, you look at the, okay. So this is 290 pages. Her book was 40 pages, but I asked her to write me a narrative, a biography of every significant thing that had happened to her, meaning it affected her positively and negatively, emotionally, that it affected her. And she did in 40 pages. And it stacked up to where, there were certain patterns that were pretty balanced. And then there were certain patterns that just went off at a right angle as far as the eye could see. And relationship occurs best in a framework of symmetry, in a framework of sustainability, in a same framework of health. And one of the most healthy whole shapes you can have is a circle. And what's healthy about it is, you have sometimes when you give and sometimes when you receive, balance. You've got sometimes when you talk and sometimes when you listen. And you have sometime when you're the leader and sometimes when you're the follower. So you've got symmetry, a yin-yang balance. When you've got a situation where you've given and 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 given so that you can give some more, because you've gotten so good at giving, now everyone else wants you to give to them. Well, where's the receiving? It's an unhealthy pattern. And so you want to know the patterns of your partner if you're intelligent. If you're so dumb to not even understand that you're dumb in that area, you may not want to know the patterns of your partner. But if you care about someone, one of the best ways to show love is bringing attention and awareness to the patterns that are most extreme in an unhealthy way, and assessing whether or not you are the person that would naturally bring those unbalanced areas back into symmetry. Because if you're just a taker who says, oh, here's someone who's really good at giving because they've given their whole life, they can give to me now. You can use the person, but you can't love the person. To love them is to help bring them back to a point of wholeness, to heal them back into a point of wholeness, to return to the symmetry of the sphere, which means that if you meet someone who's been giving their whole life, particularly who's drained around that, you want to ask yourself, are you the person who would adore giving to them? Because you've been receiving your whole life and it's about time that you have that kind of experience. Or whether, if they've always been minimized and hidden, whether you're someone who will champion their voice. Or if they're afraid to have an opinion, where you're someone who can nurture their thoughts into reality, into a beautiful, respected space. Because if you're not, and you say you care about them, then what are you doing with them? Because if you tilt the existing unbalance into a state of further unbalance, you are creating dis-ease, not healing and love. So I asked my now wife on our first date if she would write me such a document. And I gave her a much shorter version of this, to go back to disgust after meeting the horror on American faces when it came to the idea of actually understanding their partner. I realized a little graphical kid's drawing and little poetic sentences might be more digestible. So I made a 67-page kind of more of a kid's book about I like this and not this, and here's a little drawing of that, and and so it's a little bit more digestible. And even that's too much for many people. But that she wrote me the narrative, and I understood the 3 or 4 patterns that would pivot in whether she had a meaningful, important life, or whether she, down spiraled into destruction. And I felt confident and was willing to be a person that pivoted things in a healthy direction. And she made it easy for me to love her with that document. And that's the thing. Someone who loves you, love pays attention to detail. Someone who loves you and wants to care for you, wants to know these things, wants to understand them, and is grateful to you for making it easy. Someone who's in lust with you is kind of annoyed with the fact that you've actually demanded a little bit of challenge in order to fuck you. Well, you take your pick as to which partner you're going to grow with, and your reality will reflect that choice. I believe that everyone should have a user's manual or a map. Call it what you will. A map of who you are, your patterns, your psyche. A manual, how to bring out the best in you and avoid the worst in you. And I consider it a sign of singular intelligence that someone read an existing map with gratitude and write a map and learn a map of their own as an act of service and contribution. Of course, it flips. We do weird things in our cult, like don't draw attention to yourself. Who do you think you are that you're so important, as if somehow that's what we need to learn. That what we need to learn more of is how unimportant the self is. When we consider the amount of hostility directed towards ourselves and each other, I think we need to learn more, that we are actually worth making a map, that we're worth having a manual, that if a Chinese factory halfway around the world thinks that the toaster is valuable enough to write a 26-page manual, here's how you plug the plug into the wall. This button does this. This button does this. So that you can have a piece of toast. How amazing. If a Chinese factory thinks that a toaster needs a 26-page user manual so that you can get the perfect piece of toast, are you less valuable than that toaster? Because if you don't have a user's manual and a map of how to interact with you, that's what you're telling me. Toasters are important. TVs are important. Cars are important. I'm not worth it. I'm not as valuable as a toaster. And that's absurd. Now, our cult teaches us that by giving us an entire education, quote unquote, without teaching us a single goddamn thing about our emotions, about healthy relationships. Nada. In fact, it's quite the opposite. So you need to counteract the cult's ignorance. And as I say, I wrote this in a month as one of my bucket lists. I think it was 36, 38, something like that. And I had achieved most of my, quote, goals, and I was feeling restless, so I made a list of like 20 things that I thought, well, what would I like to have done before I die? And this was on them. And so I spent a year doing all my bucket list, and 1 month was writing this. And it doesn't matter how long it takes you, and it can be a growing document. And you can create a Google document and share it with others and write it together. And you can do it as a couple and write each chapter and share. You pick a chapter and you both write it, and then you share it when you've both finished and grow your intimacy. It's fabulous. I'll cover a few of my chapter headings because it's just a beginning and you want to start. So in a nutshell, this is a summary. Life story. So kind of list of a biography of a significant event. Life lessons. What I've learned out of those, what I've personally extracted out of those lessons. Worldview. Relationship paradigms. The framework within which I'm sculpting a potential interaction into something meaningful or so drab it's not interesting. Core strengths. Things I am and am not good at. And you notice when you have a pattern like this is another thing that is very difficult to penetrate when you have a high projection, low communication culture. Is there's areas that I am exceptional, and then there are areas that I am terrible. And the people who see me in the areas that I'm terrible are so arrogant they assume that I couldn't possibly be good at anything, and so they want nothing to do with me. And the people that see me in the areas that I'm exceptional think that I couldn't possibly have any mistakes and do things terribly. And so they falsely place burdens of trust that I'm not competent to meet without even having the humility to inquire about their ill-founded trust prior to making assumptions at my expense. Well, that's a horrible recipe for a relationship. So you want to know where your partner is strong and where they're weak. And it's incredibly kind to the relationships to have these contrast points. I am never interested in impressing someone in a first interaction. I want to give them a sense of range, positive and negative. And it takes time. So really a huge factor for me is someone intelligent enough to be humble and humble enough to make time to learn what they don't know they don't know. If they are intelligent enough to succeed with me. If not, it's very iffy. And it's no fun watching other people go through trauma around their own stupidity because they didn't know what they didn't know, but they're now angry at the world or at me because they didn't know what they didn't know. But they wouldn't make the time. It's frustrating. It's no fun to, be the target of that either. Control. One of the things I like to do is take trigger buttons in the culture and dwell on them. Control is one of them. It's not good to be controlling. And so it's valuable to take something like that and say, well, I'm very controlling. And here's the benefits to you of me being very controlling, and here are the downsides, the cost, the benefit, and here's why I choose to be very controlling in these environments and not at all in these environments. And these are the results, statistical probability fields. When I take over control of this area, the probability field changes from this to this. And when I don't, it goes back down again. Doesn't mean I like taking control. It just means I'm willing to get that probability field to shift. That's simply a consequence. Well, it doesn't help at all to have control be viewed innately as a dirty word. And so These things have to be teased out. Paradox, key ingredients in my relationships. What can you offer me? I mention that because it seems to be a given in many female interactions that I want to have sex with them and that's really their great offering. It's like, no. Here's why having sex with you is a terrible idea. And, have you developed the capacity to connect in this way, or this way? And would you be interested in learning? And how fast do you learn if you're interested in learning? Because I'm not interested in taking 5 years of frustration so that you can figure out all that you don't know at your pace. So what I can offer you as a lover and partner, money. It's a huge topic, so you have to explore it because people have it weighted very differently. An ideal friend, the meta conversation. If you really knew me, you would know. There I try and talk about all the things people are not likely to guess about me. Dreams and ambitions. Sexuality, monogamy. My bodies, rants about my world, logistics and routine, Asperger's syndrome. It's a useful label to cover some of these distinctions, to at least get the conversation started. My love languages, Enneagram, astrology, relevant statistics, optimal advice for women. Please don't read unless you want advice. Common misperceptions of me, drinking, smoking, and drugs. What about me? Fun ways to explore together. Do we connect? And these then break into a variety of categories. And I'll just read you one. Energy over form. It's just a random choice, and I'm not sure which chapter it's part of, but every form in this world has an energy, and all energy in our physical world has a form. Some of that energy is personal. If my parents died on a pink couch, pink couches may carry an energy of sadness for me, while for another they carry an energy of love. The greatest well-being is probable when we follow the signals from our personal energy around the choices we need to make. Logic can be a powerful tool in this process, but it is not supreme. If intuition or our feelings guide us in a certain direction and we notice that we are happier and more joyful in ways that are consistent with our values, then it does not matter what form is or if everyone else is doing it. What matters is that we follow our unique path. This sounds like something that might be from my worldview. So let's get down to business. I want you to experience the change that I've experienced by having a doorway, a map into who you are. That if you care about anyone deeply, and the woman I cared about the most when I wrote this some years ago, Francine, we were in the best relationship of our lives to that date. And after 3 years of exceptional craftsmanship and engagement on multiple levels, I wrote this book. And she knew me more than any other human being on the planet or ever had, by a long shot, by an 80% margin, because we built that kind of relationship. And I wrote this book, and I asked her how much she learned that she didn't know before, and she said a good 30%. And we had the kind of relationships that less than 1% of people have. It was more transparent, more intimate, more vulnerable, more dimensional than 99% or more of our culture. So if in that context, a relationship that's already in the 1% can jump 30% by creating a map, it would have jumped higher if she'd been willing and able to create the same map. She was not. My wife is the first woman I have met in a lifetime on multiple continents who has been willing to create such a map. One of many ways in which she stood out exceptionally in a data set of intelligence, in a data set conducive to mutual well-being. And that's, of course, what you want. You don't want what your cult tells you, particularly when it's such a miserable cult. I mean, you just look at the data set associated with any cult and you decide if you would like to take those odds. If you'd like a 98% chance of coming out poor, just go to Vegas and place 100 bets and leave, and you will have a 98% chance of being poor. If you want a relationship with domestic violence in the United States, simply go out with 3 random people, and 1 in 3 relationships in the United States contain domestic violence. So those are your playing fields. If you want to have different odds, then you've got to play with a different set of rules, which means the first thing that you need to find is someone willing to analyze the rules. We just played Scrabble with a new set of rules. I was winning constantly by using very short words and using every letter very judiciously to maximize the points per letter, which is what Scrabble sets up as a win. It's not hard to win doing that approach, but you can't enjoy creating a large vocabulary or creating long words because Scrabble doesn't reward that. If you want to enjoy creating long words, something my wife enjoys doing and I wanted to support, you change the rules of the game. So I just introduced a rule that said anyone who has a word with more than 5 letters gets double the score. So everything else stays the same, but whatever their score is, it doubles for that word. And so now we are, of course, both aspiring to create very long words, and it's fun. And now we're winning for building our vocabulary rather than doing the bizarre math of the Scrabble board game designers. And so that's an example of, change the rules and you get different results. You want someone willing to change rules. Because if all you have to do is change a rule for your entire life to shift and you won't change the rule because you're on principle afraid of change, which usually means you're in a traumatized culture, which is reflected in your own traumatic history, which makes the unknown terrifying, which makes change the enemy. Now you can't analyze the rules because they take you out of the familiar into the unknown, which is the enemy. The past trauma is always projected onto the future. The unknown represents the biggest possible trauma. You're not going to unleash the potential of your life until you can embrace the unknown as a partner. If you will create 1 paragraph or more a day about your patterns with the sole goal of allowing your best friend, which if you don't have a best friend, which is very common in our cult, because it doesn't produce a lot of best friends. It doesn't produce people with the talents to be great friends. So you may have to create a fictitious friend in your mind to write to. And so you want to write to someone who really cares about you. Hard to find sometimes. Who cares about you enough to want to see you, very difficult to find, and who wants to use what they see, positive and negative, to support your well-being and development. When you can create that and write for such a friend, Now you've got a technology. You see, I learn a tremendous amount by a friend or a possible friend or partner by their reaction to this book, by their reaction to the possibility of seeing and being seen deeply. No one who's competent and caring and committed shies away from something like this. Competent, caring, and committed. Committed means you're willing to invest, and it takes time, a lot of time, to create an exceptional relationship. Caring means you actually give a damn. Competent means you know what you're doing. And the more you know, the more you value accurate data and information, because that's what helps you be a winner. That's why you're competent. You studied the information that would help you be a winner. This is the information that would help anyone be a winner who wanted to be with me, or would, be a nice read, good inspiration, and they say, we're a terrible match, and off they go. It's a win either way, as opposed to the long drawn-out dramas of failure and misery that nobody can seem to understand, but which would be completely obvious if both people read the map of each other's love languages, psyche, trauma coping mechanisms, etc. So, and I need to update this because I didn't know what trauma was, believe it or not. After $100,000 in therapy, completely left in the dark. That gives you a sense of how informed our cult is when you can do hundreds of thousands of dollars in therapy with multiple people and major issues in the person's life go completely undiagnosed. And when many of the most intelligent things I've done in my life have nothing to do with anything a therapist or healer or anyone else has, or parent or teacher has suggested, and when my own ideas have often benefited me and others more than what I've learned from all different sides, it's a symptom. Not that I'm amazing, but that we're starting with a very low level of competency around bringing out the best in our population, in human beings. Which means we have tons of to learn, which means you want a diverse data set, and we need more experimentation when it's so easy to improve things by a factor of 10. Now, if you will write a paragraph every day and title it something, my allergies, these are my allergies. This is, okay, fine. You got your allergies that are, you have an allergic reaction or whatever. But what about, I really shouldn't drink more than half a beer. If I'm doing a test, I need to eat this kind of food. If I want to be physically active, I need to eat this kind of food. If I want to get, I'll get fat if I eat this kind of food. These are the things that I know about me and food. Well, that could take all day just to illustrate those different distinctions. And in many cases, this will be a map for you. Now, that's by far the most important thing. This will be a map for you. Because some part of you knows it, but you don't know that you know it until you wrote it down. And if this seems a little bit nebulous, Jordan Peterson has some great mapping stuff. I haven't looked into it because I'm not expecting to learn more than I learned in this discipline. But I'm delighted to find someone else out there encouraging some version of this, because it's one of the most intelligent things that you can do, and it's alarming when nobody's recommending that you do it. And it's that powerful. And so, when you have a living document like this, you can review it every 10 years. You can give it out. You can assess the intelligence of other people by their response to it. You can assess their engagement. When someone says, "Oh, I'm really into you," and they didn't think it was worth talking about this or that. You just get to see things up front that conserve a lot of time. So good luck. And if you create a user's manual, I'd like to know. And if you're interested in engaging, consider sending it to me. And I will reciprocate. It's amazing what two caring, committed, and intelligent people can do.